In a refrigerated evidence locker inside the San Diego County Sheriff's Department, a single strand of hair sat untouched for more than 3 decades. It had been there since 1988, sealed in plastic, logged into evidence, almost forgotten. Detectives believed it belonged to a killer, but for 34 years they had no name to attach to it, no confession, no eyewitness, no arrest. Just one hair clenched in the hand of a murdered young mother who had fought desperately for her life inside a quiet California apartment. And when investigators finally discovered who that hair belonged to, they realized the killer had been hiding in plain sight the entire time, not across the country, not in another state, just a few doors away in spring of 1988, Santee, California. At the time, Santee was the kind of suburban community where people left windows cracked open at night and children rode bicycles through apartment courtyards until sunset. It sat just outside San Diego, far enough from the city to feel quieter, slower, safer. That illusion shattered on May 2nd. 29-year-old Diane Lynn Dahn lived in an apartment complex on Graves Avenue with her 2-year-old son, Mark. Friends described her as warm, funny, and fiercely independent. She loved music, loved racing, and despite the challenges of raising a child on her own, she had built a stable life for herself. She worked as a radio repair technician for the San Diego Transit Corporation, a job few women held at the time. It required technical precision, patience, and intelligence. Diane had all three. People remembered her laugh. They remembered the way she lit up around her son. And they remembered something else, too. Diane was reliable. So when she failed to show up for work that Monday morning, people noticed immediately. At first, coworkers assumed she might be sick, but as the hours passed, concern slowly replaced inconvenience. Diane never missed work without warning, never disappeared, never failed to call. By the end of the day, one of her coworkers decided to drive to her apartment personally. It was a decision that would uncover one of San Diego County's most haunting cold cases. When the coworker arrived at the complex, the first thing they noticed was Diane's son. Little Mark was outside alone, wandering through the courtyard unsupervised, 2 years old, confused, silent, too young to explain what had happened inside the apartment behind him. The coworker rushed toward the child and immediately sensed something was terribly wrong. Then they went inside and found Diane dead in her bedroom. The scene was horrific. Investigators would later determine that Diane had suffered multiple stab wounds, along with blunt force trauma so severe that detectives immediately believed the attack was personal. This wasn't random violence, it was rage. The apartment showed no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no shattered windows, no evidence of a struggle at the front door. Whoever killed Diane likely entered because she allowed them in willingly. That realization changed the entire direction of the investigation. Because it meant Diane probably knew her killer, or at the very least, recognized him enough not to fear him. Outside the apartment, deputies flooded the complex. Detectives from the San Diego County Sheriff's Homicide Unit began knocking on doors, interviewing neighbors, searching for anything unusual. Had anyone heard screaming, suspicious movement, a strange car, an argument? But the answers were frustratingly thin. Some neighbors remembered vague noises, others remembered nothing at all. And in a crowded apartment complex where people lived only feet apart, the silence felt unsettling. Someone had brutally murdered a young mother while her toddler remained nearby. And somehow, nobody seemed to know anything. As investigators processed the crime scene, they found something that immediately stood out. Diane had fought back. Underneath her fingernails, forensic technicians recovered traces of skin cells. But even more important than that, clutched tightly in Diane's hand was a single strand of hair. It appeared she had ripped it directly from her attacker during the struggle. At the time, detectives understood the significance of the evidence, but there was a problem. The year was 1988. DNA technology was still in its infancy. Modern forensic science, the kind juries now expect in almost every murder trial, barely existed yet. Detectives could collect biological evidence, preserve it, and hope future advancements might someday reveal answers. But in that moment, the hair might as well have been a ghost. so investigators carefully sealed the evidence into storage and waited. Days turned into weeks, weeks became months. Detectives investigated acquaintances, coworkers, former relationships, and people connected to Diane socially. They chased leads, reconstructed timelines, examined possible motives. Nothing stuck. The case slowly began to lose momentum, and for Diane's family, the uncertainty became unbearable. Her sister, Victoria, watched the investigation drift further from resolution with each passing year. Every holiday carried the absence of Diane. Every birthday reminded them that her killer still walked free somewhere. But perhaps nobody suffered the long-term emotional damage more quietly than Diane's son. Mark Beyer had been only 2 years old when his mother was murdered, too young to remember details, too young to testify, too young to even understand what death meant. Yet the violence of that morning shaped the entire course of his life. He grew up knowing his mother had been taken from him, but not knowing why, and not knowing who. For children connected to unsolved murders, grief becomes strangely unfinished. There's no final chapter, no emotional endpoint. Just questions suspended in time, and Diane's case remained suspended for years, then decades. Meanwhile, the evidence sat in storage, waiting. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, forensic science had evolved dramatically. DNA profiling was now solving cases that once seemed impossible. Cold case investigators reopened Diane's file. This time, technicians attempted to extract a usable DNA profile from the material recovered under Diane's fingernails. In 2000, they succeeded partially. It was a breakthrough. For the first time, detectives had a genetic profile connected to the killer. But the profile wasn't complete enough. When investigators attempted to upload it into CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database, the system rejected it. The sample did not meet federal standards. After all those years, they still didn't have enough. The frustration inside the department was crushing. Detectives had finally touched the edge of an answer, only to watch it disappear again. And once more, the case fell silent. 10 more years passed. Then, in 2010, forensic scientists returned to the evidence again, this time focusing on the strand of hair found in Diane's hand. Technology had improved dramatically. Methods for extracting and amplifying DNA were now far more advanced than they had been a decade earlier. This time, the results changed everything. Scientists successfully developed a full DNA profile from the hair root. Even more significant, the DNA matched the earlier partial profile recovered from beneath Diane's fingernails. The same person had left both pieces of evidence behind. There was no doubt anymore. Diane had physically fought her killer, and she had taken his DNA with her. Investigators immediately uploaded the new profile into CODIS. Then they waited for the system to scan millions of offenders nationwide. It should have worked. If the killer had ever been arrested for a qualifying felony, the database would find him. Hours passed. Then the result appeared. No match. Nothing. The killer was not in the system. It was devastating. Imagine holding the exact genetic identity of a murderer in your hands and still having no idea who he was. The investigation stalled again. Years continued passing. Detectives retired. New detectives inherited the file. Technology advanced further. And somewhere out there, Diane's killer continued living his life untouched, until another revolution in forensic science emerged: investigative genetic genealogy. The same groundbreaking method later associated with the capture of the Golden State Killer investigation. Unlike CODIS, genetic genealogy didn't search for the killer directly. Instead, it searched for relatives, distant cousins, shared bloodlines, fragments of family connection buried inside public genealogy databases where users voluntarily uploaded their DNA to trace ancestry. The concept sounded almost unbelievable. You might not find the killer, but you might find somebody related to him, and from there build an entire family tree backward and forward until eventually one person remains. In 2020, investigators decided to try. The DNA profile from the hair was uploaded into a genealogy database approved for law enforcement use. Then detectives waited again. This time, the database found something, a distant relative, not close enough to identify anyone immediately, but close enough to begin building a genetic roadmap. What followed was one of the most painstaking phases of the investigation. Genealogists and analysts began constructing enormous family trees using public records, census documents, obituaries, marriage licenses, birth certificates, and archived records stretching back generations. The work was exhaustive, name after name, branch after branch, hundreds of people connected through bloodlines. Eventually, investigators identified nearly 4,300 individuals connected in some way to the unknown suspect. Now came the elimination process. Detectives narrowed the list by age, gender, location, timeline, who was male, who lived near Santee in 1988, who fit the profile. The massive tree slowly shrank, then shrank again, until finally one name emerged from the center of it all. Warren Robertson, 28 years old in 1988. Originally from Arkansas, living in Santee at the exact time Diane was murdered, and then detectives uncovered the detail that stopped them cold. Robertson hadn't simply lived in the same neighborhood. He lived in Diane's apartment complex, only a few doors away from her. For more than 3 decades, the answer had existed within walking distance of the crime scene. Investigators now realized something chilling. The original detectives had almost certainly crossed paths with him during the initial neighborhood canvass. He may have watched police tape flutter outside Diane's apartment while pretending to be just another concerned resident. But genealogy alone wasn't enough. Investigators still needed confirmation. So detectives quietly contacted members of Robertson's biological family and requested DNA samples. Relatives cooperated voluntarily. The lab comparisons began. And when the results came back, the match was undeniable. The DNA recovered from Diane's fingernails and the hair found in her hand belonged to Warren Robertson. After 34 years, the killer finally had a name. As detectives reconstructed Robertson's life, disturbing details emerged. Investigators discovered that both Diane and Robertson shared an interest in stock car racing. Both had reportedly attended races at El Cajon Speedway, a local racing venue popular at the time. Detectives could never definitively prove how well the two knew each other. But the shared interest suggested their paths may have crossed long before the murder. Then investigators uncovered Robertson's behavior immediately after Diane's death. At the time of the killing, he had been living in the apartment complex with his wife. Soon after the murder, he abruptly left her. He moved out, relocated nearby, then eventually fled California altogether. By the end of 1989, Robertson had moved across the country to Indiana. To investigators, the timing felt impossible to ignore: a violent murder, then sudden disappearance, new state, new life. But there was another twist waiting, and it would deny Diane's family the confrontation they had imagined for decades. Because when detectives finally went searching for Warren Robertson, they discovered he had already been dead for years. On November 25, 1999, Robertson died in a house fire in Indiana. He was 39 years old. The man who had escaped justice for over a decade had vanished long before investigators ever learned his identity. No arrest, no interrogation, no confession, no trial. For detectives, the revelation carried a strange emotional weight. They had solved the case, but justice, at least in the traditional sense, would never fully arrive. Still, for Diane's family, something profound had changed. The uncertainty was finally over. For 34 years, they had lived with an invisible question mark hanging over every memory of Diane. Now the question had an answer. In March of 2022, the San Diego County Sheriff's Department officially announced that Diane Dahn's murder had been solved. At the press conference, investigators explained the decades-long forensic journey that finally identified Warren Robertson as the killer. Diane's sister, Victoria, stood before cameras carrying emotions accumulated across more than 3 decades: relief, grief, anger, exhaustion. She admitted there were years she feared the truth would never come. Years she believed she might die without knowing who murdered her sister. But now she knew. And for the first time since 1988, the silence had finally been broken. Mark Beyer, the little boy once found wandering alone outside his mother's apartment, was now an adult, old enough to understand everything, old enough to grasp how one violent morning had altered the trajectory of his entire life. He spoke about the strange loneliness of growing up attached to an unsolved murder, the emptiness of never having answers, the emotional shadow that followed him through childhood into adulthood. And though no investigation could return his mother, the truth gave shape to the void. It transformed the unknown into something real, something final. Today, Diane Dahn's case stands as one of the clearest examples of how modern forensic genealogy has transformed criminal investigations. A single strand of hair, preserved for decades, waiting for science to catch up. In the end, Warren Robertson escaped prison. He escaped a courtroom, a sentence, a jury, but he never escaped Diane. Because even in her final moments, she held on to the evidence that would someday expose him. And more than 30 years later, from inside an evidence locker, nearly everyone had forgotten. That final act of resistance spoke for her.